You're listening to Princess of Shadows, written and narrated by Leona Urbansky, brought to you by Mythweaver Books. Nyx tore into her chambers like a whirlwind, ripping the tiara out of her elaborate hairstyle and throwing it on the bed, ignoring the pulled-out hair that went with it. It landed with a soft thump amidst the many scrolls and books piled on the bed, testament to her intense studying before the court session in what she knew now was a futile attempt at understanding her kingdom. Her hands clenched and unclenched as she fought to control her anger. This was the last straw. She had to get out of here. The castle was weighing down on her chest like a stone, and she couldn't breathe. Scrabbling with her nails for the laces on the back of her gown, she finally found the knot tying them together and pulled it free. Loosening them enough for her to wiggle out of the dress, she let the star-studded black silk fall to the floor as she dove into her closet, finally finding her casual, daily wear of tunic and leggings. She collapsed back on the bed with her boots in hand. It was in the middle of lacing them up that Rosalind appeared. She had been Nyx's steady companion since childhood, and they had grown up together in the castle. The handmaiden raised an eyebrow at the discarded tiara and gown, and Nyx flushed. "I'm sorry, Rosa," she said awkwardly, but didn't give up unlacing her boots at the same time. Rosa sighed, but said nothing, just picked up the gown and shook it out before carrying it back to the closet. "The court session went as usual, I take it?" she asked from the depths of the wardrobe. Nyx grunted as she pulled on the other boot. "I was just a useless court ornament, if that's what you mean. They didn't even allow me to speak with anyone, just announced me, then sat me in that stupid little throne while they held judgment." She blew out an exasperated breath, then pushed her tangled black hair out of her face. "I'm so tired of being useless," she started, then stopped, realizing it was sounding like a whine. Rosa hummed thoughtfully as she picked up the tiara and began wiping off the fingerprints. "I'm not the person to pass judgment, Your Highness," she said as she walked to the jewelry cabinet. Nyx groaned. "Not you, too," she complained before burying her face in her hands. "Look," she finally said, looking up and meeting the maid's eyes. "I just need to get away for a little bit, okay?" Rosa tucked her hands into her skirts, her normally calm face creasing with worry. "Not there again, please," she said quietly. "It's the only place they won't look for me," Nyx replied, just as quietly to keep from being overheard. Not that there was much chance of that, given where her quarters were. She had her own wing in the castle, and was mostly kept isolated, only being trotted out once a month like a prize pig to reassure the kingdom that she was alive and that her powers were under control. That and her shadows kept people from seeking her out. Rosa was her only steady companion, now that the regular schedule of tutors had stopped thanks to her awakening. "But the lake," Rosa started, then sighed at the look in Nyx's black eyes. "Just be careful." Her eyes flicked upwards to Nyx's unbound hair. "Do you want me to braid your hair?" Sighing in relief that Rosa wasn't going to fight her on this, Nyx finished tying her boot and stood up. Running her hands through her hair to get rid of the elaborate hairstyle, she shook her head and grabbed a black ribbon off the side table. "No, this will do. I won't be long, I promise," she explained as she tied back her waist-length hair with the ribbon. Rosa placed a gentle hand on Nyx's shoulder. "Come back quickly," she pleaded. Nyx nodded, patting her hand. Twisting her left hand to summon the darkness, the Princess of Shadows stepped into a dark corner and vanished, leaving Rosa behind to wonder if she'd done the right thing. Nyx took a deep breath as she appeared next to the forbidden black lake. Glancing around to be sure no one was watching, she edged her way forward onto the black rocks and out of the shadows. The lake water was inky black, with little to no light in her underground kingdom. Bioluminescent moss was the only light around her, and she was grateful for the shadows that lingered in the corners of her body. It made it easier to escape if she needed to, though the further from the shore she went, the harder it would be. Finding the large boulder that rested half in the water and half on the shore, she clambered onto it. This boulder was the first of a series of stepping stones that led to a tiny island in the middle of the lake. Calling it an island was generous, she mused as she hopped from one stone to another. The rock in the middle of the lake was just a large stone that had been flattened by centuries of water pouring over it. In another century, she was sure it would be completely under the water. For now, though, it was one of the few places she felt comforted by. The stone itself was covered in the white moss, giving it a soft glow and making it impossible to directly shadow step to it. That was the real comfort, that she would be normal, unable to make the shadows obey her in this place. Her loosely bound hair swayed as she jumped from rock to rock, and she regretted not letting Rosa braid it. Ignoring it the best she could, she kept her focus on not slipping on the wet stones. Finally reaching the island, she settled herself onto the soft moss with a sigh. While not nearly as comfortable as a chair in her own chambers, the moss provided her with a different sort of comfort. Being able to get away from the castle, to claim her own space, and have time to stew over her situation and try, yet again, to figure out a way around it. Her upbringing hadn't been all bad, she was forced to admit. Her parents had known the need for her to have companions and proper education. She had been surrounded by the children of the court and had several fast friends. The tutors that taught her were thorough in their scholarship, and she was well educated by the time she turned 16. That was when things went south, she reflected sourly. The powers of the underground had blossomed in her, as they always did in the shadow realm at that age. While shadow spells weren't uncommon in the kingdom, her total control over them was terrifying. Everyone she knew was suddenly shrinking back in terror at what her shadows wrought. There was a time that she had shaky control over them, but now they obeyed her with barely a thought. They swallowed up whatever she asked of them, including herself. That was how she mastered what she called shadow stepping, when no one else in the kingdom had ever even heard of the possibility. The shadows held her gently as they consumed her, and when she told them her destination, that's where they deposited her. She had found this lake by complete accident the first time. She had still been figuring out the best way to communicate with the darkness, and had gotten confused about her destination request. It had deposited her here, at this forbidden lake. Nyx knew her geography well enough to know right away where she was, and had initially been frightened and withdrew back to the castle. The more she thought about it, though, the more curious she grew. So she went back. Then she went back again and again. The evil that had once dwelt here, that prompted the decree, was long past. Here Nyx found only peace. The princess shook her head slightly, banishing the old memories and focusing on her current situation. How could she convince her parents that her powers were under her control? No one had actually gotten severely hurt or killed while she'd been learning. There'd been a small incident with the son of that noble, but her parents had assured her that what happened to him had nothing to do with her, and they'd had no reason to lie. She knew her powers could be deadly, but they were under her control. Instead of reassuring the kingdom, though, her parents locked her away in her wing and forbid her from interacting with anyone unless absolutely necessary. That hadn't helped abate the kingdom's fear at all. It was only at the monthly court sessions that anyone saw her, and she always made sure to keep a tight control on her powers, never letting anyone see them. For all they knew, it would appear she no longer had the powers at all. Nyx truly didn't know what her parents were thinking. She was the only heir, locked in the castle and never seen. She'd studied enough history to know this wasn't a good idea, that it wasn't good for the kingdom at all. But the fear of her shadows seemed to have taken a firm root in their hearts, and while they appeared to welcome her at the court sessions, she was well aware that it was a mask. She buried her head in her arms. What else could she possibly do to make them realize what was really happening? How could she convince them to let her help, to be a part of her people, and not just some frightening figure trot out once a month just to let people know that she was alive? How would her kingdom react when she became queen? And they said it would be impossible to get near the Shadow Princess. The words broke the silence, and Nyx whipped her head around to see a figure standing at the edge of the lake. The shadows were thick around them, but she could faintly make out a hood pulled low over their head. Nyx shifted to kneel on the rock, acutely aware that the only shadows around her were in the water itself. What had previously been a comfort had become a danger. Plus the water. The water was the dangerous part of this lake. As long as she stayed out of it, she was safe. But now she was cornered on this island. She shook her head sharply, refocusing her attention on the figure on the shore. "Who are you?" she growled, wishing she could wrap the comforting coolness of the shadows around her fingers. The figure hopped along the stepping stones with ease, but also with care to make sure he didn't slip on the rocks. He was only 2 stones away before Nyx realized just how close he was. Not that she could do anything about him, she was forced to admit. The shadows had always been her protectors. Without them, she was harmless. Now that he was closer, she could see it was a taller man, with his cloak hood pulled low over his face and a sword slung at his hip. Nyx caught her breath at the sight, and forced herself to try to meet his eyes, but was unable to find them in the depths of his hood. "Rest easy, princess," he said, the amusement obvious in his voice. "I've no inclination to hurt you." He turned, scanning the lake around them, one hand on the hilt of his sword. "I do have to say, though, you find the most isolated places to sulk." "I'm not," she started to snap, before catching herself and taking a deep breath. "What do you want, then?" she asked. "Just to make sure you're safe. No one's spoken to you in years, after all." Nyx stiffened, drawing herself to her full height. "And what concern of that is yours?" Suddenly he was on the rock right next to hers, not yet daring to set foot on her island, but close enough that it startled her into stepping backwards. Her foot slipped, and she almost went backwards into the water, before a firm hand wrapped around her wrist and pulled her back upright. As soon as she was steady, the man released her, crossing his arms. "As a citizen of this kingdom, I think I have a right to know that a princess is safe," he said, as though nothing had happened, but she could still feel the burn of his gloved hand on her arm, a stark contrast to her usual coolness. He looked up slightly to meet her eyes, and she realized that he wore a mask covering the lower half of his face as well as the hood. Nyx's breath shallowed at the true meaning of his words. Not that she was safe, as in whole and well, but that she was safe to be around, in control of her power. She slowly let go of the small amount of shadow she had accumulated without thinking about it after almost falling. "I am safe," she said haughtily, raising her chin, "as the entire court sees every month. Surely you'd heard the news." He mused. "I'd heard it." His tone was skeptical, and she could tell his eyes had followed the shadow's descent to their normal place at her feet. "But there's nothing like independent verification. So, tell me, princess, what would you do if I was on that rock beside you?" Nyx crossed her arms, trying to hide the fear but failing as her eyes flicked to his blade. He saw, and raised both hands, keeping them away from the hilt in an obvious gesture of peace. Why should I trust a man who won't show his face to be that close to me? She retorted. He chuckled. A fair question. He pondered for a moment before reaching up and pushing back the hood of his cloak, revealing deep auburn hair that barely swept the back of his neck. Is this sufficient? You still wear a mask, she pointed out. Surely you'd give a man some measure of anonymity, he replied, amused. Surely you'd give a princess some measure of trust, she shot back. His eyes, as dark as the water around them as she observed, seemed to weigh her for a long moment. I'll take off the mask once I'm on that rock beside you, he bargained, crossing his arms and mimicking her. Nyx held her breath a moment, unsure, then nodded sharply and stepped back, wondering if he knew what his presence beside her would mean. With a nod in reply, he leapt up onto the rock. Nyx almost stumbled back again, not really expecting him to take her up on the offer, but she steadied herself quickly, glaring at him. His eyes crinkled as he was obviously smiling, and one hand was halfway to her arm upon seeing her start to stumble, but he let it drop once she was steady. "And the mask?" she said sharply. Very slowly, reluctantly, he reached up and pulled the mask down. As more of his face was revealed, Nyx gasped sharply and stumbled back. His arms shot out again and grabbed her above the elbows, keeping her from falling into the water. "You!" she exclaimed, grabbing the few shadows he had brought with him and forming them in a blade across his throat, ignoring his grip on her arms. He stilled immediately, his fingers tightening on her arms as he felt a cold shadow lay across his neck. He met her eyes, raising an eyebrow and a smirk growing on his lips. "What happened to being safe, Princess Nyx?" he asked. Nyx practically growled, longing to wrench his hands off her arms, but unable to do so without risking falling into the water. Her shadow blade would have to do to keep him still. The shadow was not technically a blade, but rather a mouth. With her thought, it would eat into his neck and consume his flesh. "Being around you is not safe for anyone," she answered, still with a tight control on her shadow. "And the fact that you're still alive should tell you how safe I am." "Fair enough," he allowed. "But what if I do this?" He suddenly pulled her closer, leaving barely a breath of air between them. Nyx sucked in a breath in shock, his hands hot upon her arms. She would swear he had fire magic with the way she could feel the heat, even through his gloves. "Are you still safe to be around, your highness?" Nyx growled at him. "I haven't killed you yet, have I?" He eyed her contemplatively. "Which I am thankful for. But speaking of, what will it take to get that shadow off my neck, your highness?" he asked, his voice low. "How you found me," she snapped, getting her composure back, "and why you approached me in the first place." "Would you believe me if I said your parents were concerned?" he tried. "No," she said sharply. He sighed heavily. "Fine. In that case, you're forcing me to reveal the person who only has your best interest at heart. And that is Rosa." Nyx's jaw dropped. How does she know you?" she whispered. "You're a murderer." He looked at her sharply at that. "My name is Ambrose," he said stiffly, finally dropping his hands. "Do you mind?" He pointed to the shadow still laying across his throat, the cold settling in his skin like a band of ice. "If you make one false move," she started to say. "Yes, yes, you've made your point," he said drolly, raising an eyebrow. "Besides, you're the one that seems to be trying to fall off this rock, princess." Nyx frowned, but withdrew the shadow, coalescing it around her fingers in a small globe. Ambrosia's other eyebrow raised. "Your powers are fascinating," he murmured, hovering his hand over the globe, but not quite touching it. Nyx tamped down the odd flush of pleasure his words gave her and focused on what he'd said. "Rosa," she demanded, "is she okay?" "Of course she is," he assured her, raising his eyes to meet hers. "I would never harm her. And murderer is a bit of a misnomer. Then what would you call yourself?" Now she raised a dark eyebrow with that piece of information. "Framed," he said bluntly. "What? But but father said—" Yes, he would say that. He needed a convenient scapegoat. Nyx frowned, opening her mouth to speak, but then whirled around, her shoulder brushing against his chest, and he automatically brought his hands up to steady her, afraid she would fall again. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, the shadows dark against her hands as she raised them. Suddenly her hair fell loose around her, and she snapped her head back to see him pocketing her black ribbon. "To prove to Rosa I found you," he said with another smirk. "Now go. They're looking for me." "But—" "Go, princess," he ordered, turning and pushing her towards the stepping stones while still not letting her slip. "Rosa said you need shadows, and you'll not find them here." "But I want to know what you meant about being framed," she hissed. Ambrose hesitated, looking at her. "Another time," he finally said with a shake of his head. "Now go." The sound Nyx had heard, the click of claws on stone, was coming closer, and Nyx finally gave in. Leaping from stone to stone, she turned to see Ambrose only a stone behind her, using his hand to steady himself on the final stone as she reached the rocky beach. "I'll come back," she promised, gathering the shadows round her. He shook his head, but she didn't see it as she vanished into the darkness. "Rosa!" The call rang through the chambers as Nyx appeared in the shadows of her bedroom. The maid dropped the sewing she was holding, startled. "Rosa!" Nyx exclaimed again, running over to her. "Why would you do that?" Rosa swallowed, her green eyes worried as she slowly folded up the mending in her lap. "Thank the darkness you're safe," she breathed. Nyx stood before her, fuming, the shadows curling around her hands and up her arms. Rosa eyed her nervously, having never seen the princess's temper roused like this before. "Why, Rosa? Why would you send him after me?" "I don't know what you mean, your highness," Rosa answered carefully, avoiding meeting her dark eye. Nyx crossed her arms, the shadows still seething about her form. "Ambrose," she hissed softly. "He said you sent him after me." Rosa swallowed again. "I wanted to make sure you were safe," she said, just as softly. "He's the only one I trusted to not tell anyone where you were." "He's a murderer, Rosa." Rosa shook her head vehemently. That's that's not true, your highness." Her anger diffused by Rosa's admission. Nyx dropped into the seat next to her. The shadows fled back to their normal places in the room, flickering with the firelight. "He said that too," she said softly. Rosa shivered at the memory, picking at the mending in her lap. "It was awful," she said softly. "What happened? Why was he labeled a murderer if he isn't one?" Nyx asked, leaning forward. The maid shook her head, putting the mending into the basket at her feet. "I can't tell you that, your highness. It's not my place." "Then I will have to go back," Nyx determined. Her fingers threaded loosely together as she thought. Rosa stayed silent, regretting her choices, and knowing the strength of the princess's determination. Nothing she could say would stop her. The end. For the moment. That is the end of Princess of Shadows, written by Leona Urbansky, narrated by Leona Urbansky, brought to you by Mythweaver Books.